Yeah, so we started off the session here today. Sorry, not today. 2 weeks ago, when I started the lives, we pretty much started off the year on a particular note. And for those of you who may have seen our adjustments online, we actually pretty much on the theme of God mode this year. And we started off the year speaking about redefining your perspective, redefining your perspective of God, redefining your perspective of the Bible, redefining everything in your life from the reference point of what we are learning about God. Because a lot of us are not aware of or may not have been made aware of the fact that we all want change, we all want to see manifestation, we all want to see results. And the truth is, change in particular is simply a fruit. And it is really a fruit of redefinition and living from a frame of reference based on that redefinition. All right. So the last 2 weeks, you've been speaking about redefining how you look at the Bible, redefining how you look at God. And throughout the last 6 years of research in particular that we have been doing, we had to, especially for me in particular, who came out of the charismatic westernized Christianity, a lot of redefinition had to take place, and I had to pretty much redefine who God is, what is God's purpose here, to differentiate it from what we had been taught, the image that was actually given to us, and in doing so, redefine even how I look at the Bible. Right. Throughout the last 2 weeks in particular in those lives, one of the things that I mentioned is that I've actually had to redefine the Bible in this context. And I gave a definition that we use now at the Institute, where the Bible is not a book of rules and regulations, but it is actually the user's manual for your breath, for your spirit. And so we look at the Bible not for what not to do, we look at the Bible for what to do. We look at the promises of God to see what is actually has been breathed into us, what is in us, so that we can reproduce and create. Right. So we look at the Bible from the perspective of the user's manual for your breath. Right. That has actually also helps us to redefine how we see God, and to actually see no longer do we live from the definition of God out in the sky somewhere, but God, your breath, Christ Yeshua, the breath of life back in you. And so when we speak about God, we're actually speaking about God in us and in all things. So before we actually get back into reading Romans, because before we went to break last year in December, we actually completed 6 sessions within which we pretty much identified certain concepts within the first 4 verses of Romans, and we expounded on that. What the priesthood, what an apostle is, the whole timeline of what took place from Adam, his decision that caused men to actually fall into a substandard existence, and Yeshua being the restoration of that for all of humanity. And so before we jump back into that, tonight in particular, what I would like to do is to address timelines and the audiences of the Bible particularly. All right. So once we actually have an understanding as to, well, not this one, for this in particular, I'm going to put a lot more emphasis on the audiences that we're actually looking at. It's very, very simple. Once we come to an understanding as to what this is, then we can approach the book of Romans with, and as well as all New Testament letters after we cover this here today, we can approach it with some clarity with regards to what is applicable to us, what is not applicable to us, and read it without being all confused and going and waving back and forth with regards to what we're saying. Yeah, greetings, Nicole. Awesome to see you. Yes.
I missed you guys so much.
We miss you too. We miss you too. It's awesome to see your face and to hear your voice. I trust that all has been well.
What? I didn't hear you.
So, how have you been?
Good. I'm doing good. Yeah, just got home.
That's great.
So
That's great.
proud. Yeah, I'm back into school building. So
Okay. All right.
so it's been crazy at work. So we're still virtual and in person. So I'm dealing with kids that are remote still and in person at the same time. So
I
it's a
see.
hectic schedule, but I am grateful to be back into the school building. I miss it so much. So.
Wow. Okay. Okay. That sounds like a lot that way. All right. Nice. So let's get started here. I'm gonna actually start this presentation. All right. So as per usual, in starting this presentation here, we try to keep it as simple as we can because we don't want to actually go into hours of nuances. All right, so let me know from you. Let me know if you're seeing the screen. Are you all seeing the screen?
Yes, I see it.
Nice.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Nicely. Awesome. All right, so as I mentioned, we want to actually take a look at the Bible timeline and the New Testament audiences. Now, what we pretty much going to look at here with regards to the timeline is a simple perspective of the different worlds that actually Peter mentions in the Bible, like the one from Adam to flood, from flood to destruction, well, flood to fire, and of course the what is actually referred to by in the book of Daniel as the age of righteousness, right? And then we take a look at the audiences here with regards to the law. All right, now some of us here may be very familiar with this, and for those of you who are not familiar with this here would actually serve to give you some context with regards to Bible reading. So the first thing that I mentioned just now was actually redefining a Bible view. All right, context. The context of the Bible is everything. Now, because of the fact that we have grown up in our Westernized community, we have not grown up in the Jewish community nor in ancient Hebrew community. And so what I want to mention for some persons may not have been heard before, may not have been explained. For those of you who are very familiar with this, and I think most of us here, because we have been speaking for some time, so most of us here should be familiar with this. This in particular, when reading the Bible on a whole, whether it's Old Testament, New Testament, one of the things that we need to be familiar with is who are the audiences of the respective testaments. So the Bible in particular is divided into two, which is the Old Testament and the New Testament. Predominantly, the Old Testament is specific to those who came into contract with God, which is what we refer to as the Old Covenant. And then the New Testament pretty much starts, you can say, even though the Gospels are actually included in the New Testament, the New Testament pretty much starts by the sacrifice of Yeshua that actually made all and began to include all from the moment he shed his blood as a symbol of the ratification of the covenant. So I know the Gospels are actually in the New Testament, but if you look at this from a practical perspective, the New Covenant in particular, when we say New Testament, I'm using that interchangeably for the New Covenant. That is actually started from the moment Christ did what he did. Now, one of the biggest confusions that we have in our westernized community is that we try to take every single thing in the Bible and take it to mean and personalize it. And because we do that, we are actually overlooking some facts that are pretty much oblivious of some facts that can dramatically adjust how you are looking at the scriptures or how you're looking at the Bible. So for most people, you grab the Bible and you start to read, and you think the Bible is a manual, just this big manual. And so everything that you read, you try to, let's say, assimilate, or you try to internalize. And what tends to happen from that perspective is that you read on this page, it says this, and then you change a different letter in the New Testament, and it says something slightly different. And so you're there caught on a tightrope, trying to balance what this guy said from what this guy said. Now, even though all of them are actually saying the same thing, they're saying the same thing in a slightly different, from a slightly different standpoint. And that is what we're going to look at here. So once that comes into perspective, you can now approach the Bible without confusion and not actually confuse yourself and place yourself in a position where you're a little bit double-minded. Right now, simply put, the Bible in particular, it actually has there's reference to pretty much 3 words in the Bible. Right, one in particular. This is actually, well, we will take a look at about 2 verses in particular that actually speaks about this. The first, there are actually 3 words mentioned. The first word is actually mentioned from Adam to the flood, right? Where that is actually where we have the creation of the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Eden, where man made his decision, and that actually began to gradually go downhill from there until Noah's flood. Right? The second in particular is actually started with Noah. If you read Genesis chapter 9, for example, you realize that Noah is given pretty much the same instructions that the Adam is given in slightly different words, but pretty much the same mandate. And he goes about doing exactly what he had been told to do with regards to cultivating the ground and so on, and that is actually how he ended up getting drunk. Right? He planted a vine in the cultivation of the ground, made wine, and got drunk. Right? That word in particular, the Apostle Peter makes it very clear that word in particular, which is the second word here. No, I just labeled it word 1, word 2, word 3. That word in particular came to the end of the destruction of heaven and earth, which, by the way, is in reference to the tabernacle, the temple. Like the tabernacle and the temple symbolically represented you can say, a portable or mobile Garden of Eden, Jerusalem Eden. And so, as we see in Isaiah 65, the destruction of the old heaven and earth, or what is referred to as Jerusalem, we had the commencement of the third world, which is actually new heaven the new heaven and earth, which is where we see in Revelation 22, where, as the angel explains, God now dwells with man. Right? That is the restoration of the breath of life into humanity. And we now preach, as sons of God, we make the announcement of the fact that the breath of life is now restored into all humanity, and all they need to do is to renew their mind from codependent perspective, from using the body or the dust as the tool to discern what is functional and dysfunctional, and return that to the breath. Right? This entire thing that we're looking at here has been a very, very elusive topic within our westernized Christianity. Right? The separations have not been made, the identifications have not been made, and because of that, everybody is actually back and forth and struggling and fighting and debating and condemning. Does it make sense to everybody so far?
Yes.
All is well.
All is well. How?
Yes.
All right. Is anybody hearing this for the first time? Anybody hearing this? No, this is actually, please don't think that we're trying to put you on the spot. We just nice, relaxed atmosphere. We just want to make sure, I just want to see where everybody is. All right. Nice. So I'll give you, actually, we give two verses here in particular that actually is in reference to this. The first is where Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, he says the following. It says from verse 5, for they willingly forget the fact that the heavens existed long ago by the word of God, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed by being flooded with water. But by his word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly people. All right, so when he's making reference to the heavens and the earth there, that is exactly what Jerusalem faced. The temple was destroyed by fire. The temple. Then you have Daniel 9. In particular, you know, I heard Jesus saying this through his ministry, that the time is fulfilled. Paul also makes mention of this in Galatians chapter 4. You also hear Jesus commonly in his ministry saying that the time is not yet come. And this is actually specific to what was actually explained to Daniel by the angel Gabriel in Daniel chapter 9. I know it says 70 weeks of years or 490 years have been decreed for your people and for your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make atonement, reconciliation for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, right standing with God, to seal up division and prophecy and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. All right, so this actually shows here that at the end of the destruction of the old heaven and earth, it actually issues that age of everlasting righteousness. Now, for those of you hearing this for the first time, you may hear righteousness, and most people actually attribute righteousness to acts. All right, notice that in bracket it has everlasting righteousness, right standing with God. Right, righteousness in the Bible has nothing to do with acts, like whether you're doing something good or you're doing something bad. There is no reference point or no moral compass in the scriptures like that. Even though there is interpretation of what has been said as right and wrong in some cases. Righteousness here in the scriptures is actually a direct reference to the restoration of function. So for those of you hearing this for the first time, remember in the Garden of Eden, man was created Yahweh Elohim in flesh. He made a decision that pretty much corrupted his function and therefore an abandonment of the name. And the moment he did that, he was no longer righteous. Righteous as in no longer functional. He was dysfunctional. That dysfunction in the Bible is what has been translated as sin. And when the law came in, which is what we're going to explain just in a while, the law actually defines living from perspectives outside of the perspective of the self-existent, which is what the law of the Lord is, the principle of the self-existent. It defined using the dust as the reference point to live as sin. That actually was translated into an agreement, and so it would give the person who is not familiar with the Bible in the way that in its context the impression that sin is actually breaking the rules or breaking commandments, right? But the contract was actually just an expression of dysfunction. Sorry, the contract was actually an expression of the principle of the self-existent, which brought the dysfunction to light more. And so what you're looking at as commandments, don't do, was simply don't be dysfunctional. And when Christ Yeshua actually did what he did, he restored humanity, restored the breath of life into all humanity, and therefore all men are now back into function existentially. They're pretty much now just face the responsibility of having to renew their minds to begin to live from their righteousness. Is that making sense?
Whoops, comment, Brother Zane?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In terms of, if you could go back to the other screen there before you leave it,
Sorry.
you have in brackets right standing with God.
Right.
In essence, the way I understand it is his standing with God from God's point of view had never changed, but his standing with God changed in his mind.
Yeah.
That's where it went haywire. God never disowned us, never separated himself from us. The fall was falling away from connectedness,
Right.
or our standing with him. This is what changed, and this is what the renewed mind in Christ brings us to the awareness that we were already sons. We've always been sons. We were wayward like the prodigal, but we're coming back. We've come back home now. And Big Brother has brought us back to the Father.
Right. So we can understand it like that now because of the area that we're in. This is actually written, we must take into consideration this is written by those who are under the law. And so what they're writing here is through the knowledge of the law. So through the agreement in particular, that would be seen as right standing with God. Does that make sense?
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Which actually is also brings us to the screen here. Nice. Oops. Lord.
Hey, Norman, I think I know that teaching you're talking about, but I would think that there was a difference other than just in the mind, is that the spirit wasn't with man, abiding in man like it is today.
Again, I guess that would sort of distract from what Brother Zane is bringing us to tonight, but we can talk about that some other time if you want. That's very interesting, that point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what you're looking at there is just the nuances of what really took place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Appreciate your comment, though.
Yeah. Right. So everybody's seen the screen here. Now, here's some things that we want to take into consideration. Right, before we go through a book like Romans. Right, and it is, to say the least, paramountly important that we understand the panorama of the Bible, especially when you're reading books like the book of Romans, right? Because a lot of people read it not understanding what we're going to look at here. And so when Paul says they therefore now no condemnation, they say yes, no condemnation. And then in the chapter before, which is chapter like for example in chapter 6, where he says that he does the thing that he doesn't want to do and all of these things, they say we still have sin in us. Right? So on one hand we're saying renewed, and on the other hand it's saying that, and just as I mentioned to our Holy Brother Norman there just now, we have to take into consideration what we're taking a look at here. And once we understand this, then we'll understand the lens through which these men are speaking, and to the lens that they're using based on the audience that they're speaking to. So we do know that when Adam made his decision that actually brought I don't want to go into all of that detail here. But basically, when Adam made his decision, Adam made his decision that actually led to dysfunction. Now, the dysfunction in particular was first a decision, but his decision pretty much led to a shift in his nature. And that nature in particular, he couldn't actually change that nature. Only God could change the nature because he is Son of God after all. So when that took place, his shift was pretty much in the arena of what he was. So when Adam actually was this Adam, which is the name that we pick up from him after his decision, because the name, if you all remember in sessions last year, we identified that in the ancient Hebrew perspective, the name is actually, it comes from the breath, because from the breath is the life. When you say breath, we mean spirit. And so the name of the man in the garden would have been the name that came with the breath, which is Yahweh Elohim. When Adam made his decision was simply in his function. Now, when God breathed the breath of life into the dust, it was pretty much the merger of breath and dust. Now, we're explaining this here because we say that Adam actually, his actions caused him to reap death, but not really understanding what the death came from. And because you don't understand what the death came from, then you don't understand what the purpose of the law is. And if you don't understand the purpose of the law is, then you're pretty much mixing up the law with a moral compass and not keeping it within the lens of the functional compass. So Adam in particular was actually a living organism, and that living organism is the merger of breath and dust. The breath in particular was the breath of God, which is God's thought that was breathed into the dust. So the nature, or the energetic nature of the creature, was exactly what God thought about himself. So Yahweh Elohim in dust. When Adam made the decision, and I want everyone to take into consideration that this is actually in the realm of breath and dust. He was created, even though it was breath breathed into dust as one, he was created to live from the realities of the breath, which is the realities of the spirit. That the reality of the spirit is exactly what is mentioned in Genesis chapter 1 from verse 26 to 30 regarding authority, dominion, and all of that, power. That was actually the nature of the breath. When Adam made his decision, what Adam did was switch the function. He switched the function by simply abandoning using the breath as his frame of reference to live, to make decisions, and he chose to use the dust, his body, the senses of the body, as his dependency to determine what is functional and dysfunctional. Naturally, by doing that, the body, the dust in itself, without the breath, does not have life. So if he chooses to use the dust as the dependency to determine what is functional and dysfunctional, the senses of the dust, then he's abandoned the breath. And therefore, in the abandonment of the breath, there is no life, which equals death. Is that making sense?
On that, I find that very interesting, Brother Zane.
Mm-hmm.
I have just been working on the origin of the soul. And at this particular point in time, what you're speaking about, the word says, and man became a living soul.
Right.
If you remember the scriptures at this particular point.
Yeah.
And so I said, where is the origin of the soul? I won't go into that tonight, but I've done a paper on this. I'd like to send it to you to find out your comments.
Okay. Well, I don't know if it'd be useful for you to understand here that there's a difference between Westernized perspective of soul and the ancient Hebrew perspective of soul. So in the Westernized perspective of soul, there is they actually refer to the soul as a third aspect of the human construct. That actually came from Greek philosophers, and of course the Greco-Roman perspective that was pretty much incorporated into that. The soul in the context of the ancient Hebrews is actually the word that is actually translated as soul. It's unfortunate that they translated as soul, because that actually has caused the Westernized perspective to be pretty much attributed to what they're referring to there. But what they're actually referring to there in the ancient Hebrew perspective is the merger of breath and dust, which equals living organism. Now, when you actually, if you do a quick search, and I encourage anybody to actually do a search of the word that is translated soul in the Old Testament in particular, and you realize that word that is actually translated soul is attributed to different contexts. Like, you would say that with regards to kidnapping, for example, they would actually say that this person kidnapped the soul. They refer to a corpse as a dead soul, and many other different aspects, right? But it is actually based on their perspective of soul here being organism and living organism. As that actually began to transition into the Greek-Roman perspective, they incorporated the soul and their perspective of the soul as an independent entity, or I shouldn't say an independent entity, a middle component between spirit and body. So in the Old Testament in particular, because it actually attributes soul to breath and dust, when it actually makes reference to the soul, is used interchangeably to refer to an aspect of spirit. So there is a mixture there that could be confusing to anybody who's actually trying to understand soul through. Not that I'm saying that you are confused, I'm just saying that to the general reader, it can be confusing because of the Western perspective of soul and not their perspective of what a soul is. Does that make sense?
Again, I really find it very interesting, this whole subject. It's not because I'm trying to split hairs, but the thing is, where is the soul affiliate? What is the soul affiliated with or akin to? The spirit, or as a third element, is it associated with the spirit or with the dust? And this is the paper I've done. I've associated the soul with the dust.
Okay.
Because in our understanding, I'll just go quickly, we talk about deliverance and so on. Deliverance and generational curses and all that we've been dealing with are associated with the dust rather than the spirit, because the spirit we know is from the Father, it's pure. So it's along those lines that I've been looking at it. But I'll send you my paper if you have time to look at it. I appreciate your comments.
All right, no problem. Right, so where was I? Right. So when this actually took place, where there was a switch in function, the man actually began to use the dust, pretty much the body, as the point of reference, or the frame of reference to live. Right. Because of that, he inherited death. Right, in the context of what was spoken to him in the Genesis narrative. It is not that God cursed him. It is what he changed in his function. Now, when that took place, there is a component in the scriptures, for those of you who may really want to comprehend even why the law. Because there's a component in the scriptures that actually shows that when Adam actually made his decision, it incorporated a function into his nature that actually led to what Peter refers to as the corruptible seed. So there was a corruption of spirit, corruption of nature. And the corruption there was not as is attributed to, like, we in the westernized world, we have this whole idea of good and evil and darkness and all of these things. The Bible does not share westernized perspectives of good and evil, nor light and darkness. Adam's corruption was actually very much specific to the incorporation of a function that did not actually permit that he can live from the breath again. It was pretty much corrupted by a function that he incorporated. And then there begins the civilization of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right now, which is why you notice that Paul says that death reigned freely from Adam to Moses. Now, if you look at this, if you look at this time, this diagram here. So, Adam made his decision, which led to that corruption, which was the corruption, and that continued freely here. Now, when it says it was committed freely, that death reigned freely, it simply means that there was no established general law in particular that actually came into place to really show that they were corrupted, which is Paul's argument in the book of Romans. When Moses came along, Moses received the law of Moses. Now, the first thing I want to actually point out here is that what we refer to as the law of Moses is not a divine command to all human beings. I know it may have been understood like that, depending on your denominational affiliation. But the law of Moses was not a divine command or an expression of divine law that was imposed upon human beings. When Moses received the law, if you remember, if you go back to Exodus 34, for example, identifies how the law was an agreement that was presented to Israel. It was a contract. They were actually informed of what this contract contained, and then they agreed to keep this contract, to come into this agreement. But because the man in particular fell below and had spiritual corruption that kept him below the function of what he was originally intended to do, or originally intended to be, this law here that was given, it was given as a mechanism that was used to try to keep them responsible to the original function until the Messiah would come. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that the law was not a command to the entire earth. It was not a divine command to the entire earth. The law, as we know it in the Bible, was actually specific to a people that were given the option of accepting getting into this agreement or denying getting into this agreement. When they accepted getting into the agreement began. Which means everybody else who is not Israel had no law, no contract to which they can be held to. Is that making sense so far?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
All right. So in this case, the same now. The division here only came where there were those who were under the law from those who were not under the law. The death in the death that they were actually reaping and living from did not change. The death in all of humanity, whether you were under the law or not under the law, you experience the effects of Adam's decision, because you are, after all, descendant of this man, according to the biblical timeline. So, the rest of the world in particular, and you'll notice that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is what we call the Pentateuch in our Westernized community, or the Torah, for as it is originally known as, it is actually specific to those who were under the contract. And so you'll notice that the entire Bible is centered around Israel. The only time people who are not Israelites, not under this contract are mentioned, is when the nation of Israel comes into contact with non-Israelites. But nonetheless, everybody had the same condition. Now, when Jesus came, Jesus did not come outside here in the non-circumcised community. He came under the law, which means, as you notice, that he was circumcised, he met the requirements of the law, and lived in a community that were actually under the law. Now, the thing is with Jesus, particularly with Jesus, is that if you understand what I just explained here, is that the law, not Jesus here as yet, the law particularly was given. If you go to Numbers 15, and you can take note of that, Numbers chapter 15 actually indicated that the law was given to these people to prevent them from living from their heart, which in this case is to prevent them from living from their spirit. But spirit and heart are one and the same in the scriptures. They're just words that identify different aspects of function of the same entity. The law was given to prevent these men from living from their hearts. And that's simply because of the corruption of the Adam. His decision was an incorporation of a function that was opposite to his original intention, to his original function. The thing is about Yeshua, you notice that Yeshua in his life does not refer to the law as attributed to him, even though he met the requirements of the law to be included in the contract. He does not say our law. He always refers to the law when he's speaking to the Jewish leaders as your law. You sit in the seat of Moses. Doesn't your law say? And that's simply because Yeshua, and pay attention, it's really important that you grasp this. Yeshua did not inherit the corruption of the spirit of the Adam. The spirit came and was breathed onto the dust, which we know as Mary. And so he resembled their powerlessness, but did not have the corruption of their spirit. Therefore, even though he was signed into the contract had no power over him, because the contract only has power and is pertinent to corrupted spirits. His spirit was not corrupted, so he was not actually bound by the law. The only way the law can actually take hold of him is if he is in the category of those who the law was given to. Now, because of that, Jesus constantly refers to faith in his ministry. And that's because Jesus, in this case, the law is not specific to him, so he refers to the Abrahamic covenant, which is the only covenant that he could pretty much relate himself to. Because the Abrahamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant in particular, was actually based on faith in God. Does that make sense?
So, Zane, would you say that Jesus was the second time breath was breathed into dust?
Right.
Okay. And here you're kind of saying that they signed the contract with their circumcision?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the thing about circumcision is circumcision did not originate with the law. Circumcision originated with the Abrahamic covenant. You can go to Genesis 14 for that. And so the same circumcision, Jesus was circumcised, but because his spirit had no corruption, the contract was not pertinent to him. In other words, take, for example, a contract between a landlord and a tenant. The contract is only specific or is binding upon someone who falls under the category of a tenant. Which means, if you are on the compound of the same that belongs to the landlord, and you are not occupying an apartment, you decided to do something else on the compound, the contract does not really have any binding force upon you, because you are not in the context. In this context, you have not. The definition of tenant does not apply to you. So you're on the compound, just like Jesus. He's among them, but because he does not fit the definition of who the law is given to, the law has no hold on him. And so his circumcision, even though it was done in agreement with the law, his circumcision takes him back to the Abrahamic covenant, which is the covenant of faith. And that's why you see Jesus not speaking about law. He's saying have faith in God.
Oh, because his of the law.
Say again? I broke up there.
Because his contract was not of Abraham, or his contract was not of the law, it was of Abraham.
It's of Abraham.
So his circumcision was signed in Abraham's and not of the law.
Right. Now, the Abrahamic circumcision was for all descendants of Abraham. And so Jesus pretty much came there and he actually fulfilled being the seed of Abraham. But because he didn't have a corrupted spirit, the law, which was pretty much given to them until the Messiah arrives, did not have hold on him. Because in other words, think about this. Let's put it in a different way. Let's say Jesus is Superman, right? And he comes amongst mortals, but he does not have the power of the mortals in particular. Sorry, he doesn't have the power of Superman. So he resembles the powerlessness of humans. The law of gravity applies to humans. And so he signs the contract right there, being there, but because he is not his Superman is not human, gravity cannot hold him to the ground. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Good.
All right. So just by existence, really, because he's uncorrupted, just by existence, he has already begun to fulfill the law. Now, so we see here that Jesus here in particular is actually born under the law, but because he is not corrupted, the law cannot exert its force on him, because the law is for those who are of corrupted seed. Now, the next thing I want to point out here is that Jesus did this here. Jesus, being under the law, even though the law had no force in him, he obeyed the law because he was signed into the contract. Which means that Jesus in his ministry had nothing to do with these guys across here who had no contract. So he'd interface with them, but what he's doing here has nothing to do with them here because they were not under the law. Israel was under the law. Non-Israelites, like the Greeks, were not under the law. Is this making sense?
Yes.
Right? Everybody following this? Is this simple? I try to put this as simple as I can.
Yes. Yeah, I'm
Yes,
following you.
well, it's really good.
All right. Lovely. So these guys here are following the law. Jesus comes as a propitiation for their sin. Yeah? He does everything, fulfills the law to pull them out because they had an agreement with God. What he did here didn't really have much to do with those who were outside of the contract. Now notice, everybody he's dealing with here is the same death, just that Israelites are under the covenant and non-Israelites had no contract. So they were not facing any punishment. They were not facing any judgment. They were pretty much living by the law of sowing and reaping. Whereas these guys here, they had a contract and an agreement. Which means that if they keep the contract, they benefit from the blessings of the contract. They show indifference to the contract, they benefit from the curses of the contract. They would face punishment. They would face judgment. Now the Bible terms it as punishment, but it's really sowing and reaping in a contract. Right? So all of this continues here. Jesus fulfills the law, and then Jesus, just before Jesus dies, Jesus actually says, he begins to preach the end of the world. Remember when they asked him, when will these things be fulfilled? Matthew 24. Everything that he said there was on this side here. That had nothing to do with these guys across here. That's why the westernized expectation of coming judgment and destruction is very creative. Because the destruction and judgments can only come by breaking the contract. These guys, the non-Israelites, everybody who is outside the law, had no contract. So God has no reason to judge them. They just reap what they sow. Is that clear?
Yes.
All right.
Very good.
Nice. Now, Jesus,
Yes.
okay. So Jesus then goes to the cross. Right? Now, when Jesus goes to the cross, Jesus does two things. This is where Jesus is actually helping them here to redeem them from their sin. And the only sin that these guys had across here was what they inherited from Adam. Which means in this spectrum here, let's put it like this also, in this spectrum right here, the only person that could sin after Adam was the person that was under this contract. After Adam's sin, nobody across here is attributed with sin. They're just sowing they're just reaping what they sow. Does that make sense also?
That's very lovely. Yeah, very lovely explanation.
Yeah.
Right. That's why Paul says one man sinned and all men inherited it. Only those who are under the contract could sin after Adam's sin because they had an agreement, a mutual agreement, and they decided to show indifference to the agreement. So Jesus came and actually redeemed these guys from sin. Jesus could not redeem these men from any sin that they were doing. because they had no contract for them to break. What Jesus came to do was to deal with the sin that they inherited. Now, when he went up on the cross, Jesus actually was a propitiation for these guys' sin. And then he took the whole identity simultaneously, the whole corrupted spirit, the whole identity that it took from the tree, and he nailed it back to the tree, which is the cross. Now, in doing that, he did two things. Number one, he dealt with their contractual problems, redeemed them from that, for those who would accept it. And he changed these guys' spirit, giving them a new spirit. Now, technically, everybody's spirit is renewed. Just that these guys in a separate category, they not only needed a new spirit, but they needed to actually get redemption from their breaches of their contract. Now, after Jesus ascended, it just became all and in all. So now, what you're looking at here is now Yeshua is in both parties. When you're reading the New Testament, now this is where context comes in. When you're reading the New Testament, now you have to pay attention to who is speaking and to whom they're speaking. Because if you read the disciples, James, Peter, John, they speak about Yeshua through their knowledge of the law. So they speak about sin and redemption from sin. While Paul, who is preaching to those who are uncircumcised, he does not pretty much tell them about sin. He tells them about the new man. Because that's the only problem they have. They have been given a new
That'll
spirit.
ruffle some feathers.
Yeah, but it's necessary for you to understand it so you can understand the context of the New Testament, right? So for these guys here who had no sins, they only had an inherited sin and were just sowing and reaping, he speaks to them about the new man. Now, when he writes letters to these guys here, he speaks about the new man and the old man, which is the new spirit and the old spirit. And when he talks about sin, he makes it very clear that he's speaking about sin simply because of this simple fact. Pay attention. Because there was nothing here after Adam for these guys to tell them something was wrong with them, they are pretty much living comfortably, manifesting the corrupted nature, but really don't know what the problem is. Because the only way these guys here knew what the problem was is because the law was given. And because the law was the principle of the self-existent, which was an expression of the man before he made his decision in the garden, they realized that they were catching their skin to keep this law, which highlighted that there was a problem with their nature. These guys here had no agreements, nor any knowledge of the law. So they had nothing, they don't know something is wrong with them. They just know that they're sowing and reaping, and this is what they're feeling.
Zane,
Uh-huh.
is that why Pilate said to Jesus, "What is truth?"
Yeah. Yeah. Because only the Israelites have the principle of the self-existent expressed in a book. So they know this is truth. These guys were not uncircumcised, so they had no access to learning that because the Israelites kept it within their circle. So these guys became philosophers of what could be and what could not be because they have no reference point for truth. So Paul speaks to these guys here about the new man, and the only way for Paul to tell them that something is wrong with them is to use the law to explain it. not because they were under it. It's the only thing that he has to tell them that this is not right. So he's using it to pull the principles out of it, to explain the new man. Whilst Peter, James, and John are reading here and they're talking about sin because that is their paradigm.
This is good. This is real good.
So then that would mean saying that the others, those who were not under the law, they don't need salvation, right?
Salvation for them was actually a change of the spirit, which is the reintroduction of the breath of life.
Gotcha.
Which is why Paul, in his letters to the Ephesians, the Colossians, he refers to Christ as the savior of the body, which is the breath of the body. He does not tell them that you all are sinful. He uses the law to explain that there is a problem. Nobody informed you of the problem. This is your memo. And this is why this change of spirit is important.
This is so good because everybody always, the religious always talk about focusing on sin, and
yes,
it's like we can't focus on the sin.
Right. So when Paul is speaking to Gentiles or those who are not under the law, he speaks with one balance, with one dialect.
That's why it says we're not under law, we're under grace.
When he's speaking to those who are under the law, he speaks with a different balance because he has to speak to them in their language.
I opened it up and I had to fix it.
Does that make sense, everybody?
That makes sense, Zane. Also, what happens is in Scripture, there is specific, how should we say, a reference to sin singular and sins plural.
Yeah.
So I can see the sins singular attributing to, if you wish, the Gentile line.
Yep.
Sins plural would be those under the law who commit sin.
Right.
Is that right?
Perfectly right.
So we are not under the law, we're under grace.
We were never under the law.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
We were never under the law. So, in other words, so let me put it like this also. Like, just to Holy Brother Norman's point, you notice that Peter, James, and John speak to the audience, and he's speaking about sins. Paul speaks to the Corinthians and he says he became sin, which is dysfunction, one sin, one dysfunction that everybody inherited, so that you could become the righteousness of God. Breathing the breath of life back into you again, so that you are now in union with God again. No longer separated by your dysfunction. All you need to do is to renew your mind to what took place, and you begin to manifest life. These guys across here, on the other hand, they have a different tongue, because this is what they memorize. They memorize this like you went to school to learn mathematics and English and social studies. They went to school to learn Torah. So to speak to them, you have to speak to them in a language. Now, through Jesus doing this, Jesus actually took the two of them and brought them back to one man, because now both parties. This is where the conundrum is. Both parties have actually been renewed as beings. Just that this party has a different perspective through what they learn, and this party doesn't share their perspective because they never thought that something was wrong with them. They were just living and reaping and experiencing sowing and reaping. Now, in doing that, basically what's going on now is that these guys need to sort out the differences, because the battle in the New Testament is these guys saying to these guys, you need to follow this, whilst these guys saying to these guys, we don't need to follow that. Because the problem is the spirit. If we live in the spirit, then we don't need this. But these guys were walking around trying to tell these guys, if you had to walk in the breath of life, you need to learn this, because this is an expression of the principle of the breath of life. not realizing that the only reason that they received this book for them in particular was to actually keep them from living from their heart and to have a reference point as to what God is like, because they are corrupted. Now that they are new, they don't really need this. All they need to do is to learn Christ, what the breath of life is, and everybody is one humanity, which is what we have here now. Now, having said that,
Oh, okay.
having said that, this is Paul's conundrum even with the Galatians, because the Galatians had no law, but the Jews came in and started to tell them, you need to keep the law. And Paul tells them, if you get under the law, then you will bind yourself according to the force of that law, which is why he tells them that you're stupid. Because the law does not actually apply to you anymore, because it applied only to men who were corrupted. Christ renewed the breath of life to all humans, to all humanity, and therefore you are using this and it does not compute. The only thing it will do is become a stumbling block, because what you'll be doing is that you have a new spirit, but you're using the law, and so if you're using the law, you're living from the paradigm that you are separated from God, or that you are corrupted and you still need help. And therefore, if that is the case, then everything that the law says not to do, you will do, because you're not living from the breath. You're using an external reference point to tell you what to do.
Makes so much sense. I love this diagram. You've nailed it. I mean, it's perfect the way you have done this tonight.
Well, I'm glad that it is beneficial. Now, that now brings question to the entire westernized perspective, because everybody fighting to get under the law in the Western world, and nobody was circumcised unto the law, nor were they baptized in Moses. They were baptized in Christ. So just a confused bunch of people that fighting for what is not theirs.
Wow. And I see this a whole lot now. Now that when you explain this tonight, I see that a lot of people are doing the external reference point, like you just said.
Right.
Yeah. So that's, and I see it when it come up. That's why I have this what you call it, irritation in my spirit. Like, you know, I want to be able to tell them something. So yeah, I'm learning.
So is this clear?
A point I'd like to make, Zane, is this: when at the cross, the two were made one. The two, if you wish, the two branches there. But thereafter, we say, to make it valid for us, we must receive Jesus in our hearts and ask God to forgive us our sins and enumerate our sins.
Right.
This is the formula the Western world has given to evangelize. It's kind of mixed up when you compare it to what you're showing us.
It is a big yarn of confusion. Because here's the problem with this westernized perspective. They are pretty much telling you that you are under the law, which is not true. And to be under the law, you needed to sign the contract by circumcision and being baptized unto Moses. So what's taking place is that Westerners are being told by the evangelism that you are under the law and you need forgiveness of your sins. The problem is, if we do what we are evangelizing in the Western world, in the legal field, it will be called fraudulence. Because what you're doing is actually claiming the force of a contract that you did not sign.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. That's deep.
That's where the religion starts then.
That is the only source of the religion. And let me just expound and unpack that. So get this. Remember, the law was actually given to those who had corruption of nature. Therefore, if you're under the law, you're pretty much living from the paradigm that you are disapproved, from the perspective that you are disapproved, and keeping the law is actually you living by approval. When they now come and do the same thing, what they're pretty much telling everybody that you are not approved by God, and you need to fast, pay tithes, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, to be approved by God. The problem with that is when Jesus did what he did here on the resurrection, he gave everybody on both sides the breath of life, which means to walk in Christ is to walk from the paradigm that you are now approved by God.
Excuse me, Brother Zane.
Mm-hmm.
That being the case, my understanding is whether I receive Jesus in my heart or not, that I have been by his merits reestablished with the Father without my having to invite him and make that step of deciding to invite him in, and that will give me salvation by my acceptance. I don't have to accept anything. I have, by virtue of what he did, eternal life.
You receive it.
Is that correct?
That right there is why there is nowhere in the Bible that says that you need to accept Jesus to get anything. It says acknowledge.
Yep. So the whole sinner's prayer thing goes out the window.
It's very creative.
Hey, Zane.
Uh-huh.
I always thought, when I learned the kingdom, I be like, I said, Jesus ain't telling nobody to come to the front, and he didn't tell nobody to do nothing.
What's the context of sin in Acts like 26:18?
All right, so let me get you this, and then we will jump on that, right?
All right.
We'll come to that. All right, so everybody everybody understands this here, right?
Totally.
Yeah. Yes.
So this right here, Hannah, you want to say something?
I do actually.
Go ahead.
You can read my mind, can you? What about Noah?
What I want to know.
All those people everyone got killed. Like, what's that? What was that?
So prior to the giving of the law, there is evidence prior to Moses, so in this case Noah, that when Adam actually made his decision, this is actually unfortunately translated in the Genesis, from Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 6, in a way that because the Westerners have been taught what we had been taught, you're reading it and you're reading the Westernized perspective of the Bible into it instead of reading it for what it says.
Okay.
When Adam made his decision, the knowledge of the self-existent was apparently passed down. And there were men on the earth that were actually they were actually living from the knowledge of it. And they, in Genesis chapter 6, are called the sons of God. How we know that is that in Genesis chapter 4, in particular, the last verse of Genesis chapter 4, because Genesis chapter 5 is pretty much an interlude in the narrative. Genesis chapter 4, it actually says that men began to call upon the name of Yahweh again, which is self-existent, and it attributed the name Enosh to that name. If you view the Old Testament from that moment on, in the Hebrew, you will notice that there is a difference between men who are Adam and men who are called Enosh. The sons of God in Genesis 6 are called Enosh in the Hebrew, as well as the people who say that God and the angels came to see Abraham, they are called Enosh, which means those were not some abstract spirit beings. These were men on the earth who who were actually priests of Yahweh. And so that knowledge was passed down, which is why Sodom and Gomorrah was actually destroyed. But Westerners don't know that. Sodom and Gomorrah, in the Hebrew, the men of Sodom and Gomorrah are called Enosh, which means Sodom and Gomorrah was first a priestly nation. And they decided to make a decision to go to walk in the opposite of the priesthood, and they were literally searching for priests of Yahweh in the city and sodomizing them. Which is why the Bible says that they sinned against Yahweh, because they had the knowledge of Yahweh that was passed down from generation to generation through this priesthood. And they in particular decided that they wanted to go contrary to that. So in Noah's time, there wasn't a contract, but the knowledge of the self-existent that was passed down. And that in particular is what everybody was pretty much holding themselves responsible to, according to the narrative.
So that was before the contract, but they knew because of what they were told.
What they were taught.
Generations, and it was close enough generations where they still had heard the stories and known who they were.
No, if you check the biblical timeline, Shem was alive when Abraham's father was alive. He was still alive. So these men were born, but these men lived long. So you might think, we look at it from the perspective that, well, they lived 70 years, but really and truly, because the 900 years these men live, many generations benefited from their knowledge.
Yeah.
So they were like the teachers of the generation, because they were the men who had the knowledge, and every generation comes in is benefiting from their presence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that does. Thank you.
All right, no problem. Nice.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Enoch people?
What would you like to know?
Are they the ones that went to the daughters of men?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, but I can't go unpacking that here because that'll take us down a whole different road. So
yeah.
I have one question about the Enoch. Can I have one question about the Enoch?
Uh-huh.
I always thought the Enochs, well, I heard you say something about they wanted to go into men.
Right.
The Enoch they were gay?
No. The Enosh were those of the men who actually came into living from, it was, let's say, like the priesthood of Yahweh.
Uh-huh.
So when they came into the priesthood functioning in Yahweh, they were referred to as Enosh. And by functioning like that, there was a clear evidence that these men walked in a certain level of spiritual power also.
Okay.
But just as Genesis 6 said, the Spirit of God couldn't strive with them anymore, because the Spirit of God will come upon them for them to walk out the name of Yahweh. But because of the corrupted nature, there will always be a battle between God's perspective and what they're feeling inside of them.
Okay, gotcha. So this Enoch, is this the same Enoch that disappeared?
Not Enoch, Enosh. SH.
Okay, got you. Okay,
Yeah.
Okay.
So is that race still on the earth today?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a race. It was actually those who came into, let's say, the sect of those who committed their lives to that, who were called Enosh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So were they the two guys that came with Melchizedek to Abram then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
They are called angels.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, because I can't practice here.
Yeah.
But they are called angels because in the scriptures, the main priest, or the high priest, is the one that will actually take on the name of Yahweh, and they will refer to him as Yahweh. And the assistant priests were usually referred to as angels.
Okay, so what about Melchizedek then?
He was exactly that.
He was what?
Say again?
He was what?
A priest.
Yeah.
Priest, yeah. That's why he takes on the name Lord Most High when he's blessing Abraham, because he's a priest. And
So is he a type of Enoch, or he's something kind of different?
When you say type of Enoch?
Well, you said that. Sorry, you said that these ones were Enoch.
Oh,
was he a type of Enoch, or?
No, this is not a type. This is a people actually that commit their lives.
That's what I meant. But was Melchizedek and
yes,
considered
definitely.
it? Oh, okay, that's what I said.
So then, in the New Testament, when when Jesus, after he was baptized in the Jordan, he restored that priesthood again.
In the Jordan?
Well, at his baptism or somewhere along that timeline. When was the priesthood restored again?
The Aaronic was replaced.
The Aaronic was replaced by the Melchizedek one.
The Aaronic was replaced the moment he shed his blood.
Okay, it was when he shed his blood then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't when the Holy Spirit when the heavens opened and the Holy Spirit came upon him.
No.
It was at the shedding of the blood. It was the covenant again, the Abraham.
You're right. Because the only way for others to be that, he would have actually had to renew them.
So then that's the order that we all came into.
Yes, ma'am.
So
say again?
Oh, so why then do a lot of westernized ministries do generational cleansing and all this stuff?
Sheer ignorance. Sheer ignorance. I mean, with all due respect, but it's sheer ignorance.
Yes, it is. I used to be one. Yeah.
It's sheer ignorance.
Because it's a huge yeah, it's a huge
movement. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a huge movement. Yeah, and yeah.
It's sheer ignorance.
So what should we be doing then?
Learning what your breath is. What your breath is and what it has in it to manifest.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we do. Learn the breath of life, which is Christ.
Well, yeah, I've been doing that, and I've seen the difference because I've got friends in both, and I can't do the generational cleansing anymore. So.
Right. And Jesus told us. He said his yoke is light. I forget how you say it,
but it's amazing.
He says, "Come learn of me."
Yeah. But it is amazing how people are getting free out of that system. Maybe it's because God is gracious and.
Yes, indeed, He is.
Yes, He is, and He's simple.
He is.
Yeah.
You don't make all this stuff all hard.
I mean, people are definitely getting healed from that system. In that system of, say, if you lie boss somebody, or there's a whole lot of ministries. There's sozo, and there's storing the foundations and all that stuff, and it's all work. It's hard work.
You see, and I'm saying this to your point, Holy Sister Monica. You have to understand that Westernized Christianity got its strength and its foundation and its start from Westernized church fathers, not from apostles who have the thought heritage of the scriptures. Every church father that we're talking about here are Westerners.
So true. So true.
Surmised. They're surmised, and all Westernized theology is based on them.
Right.
So once you understand that, then you understand this right here is a big movement that has nothing to do with the Bible.
You have a teaching on that, Brother Zane, in particular, because that is huge. Are we in delusion as we see this actually functioning?
Yes.
Delusion will be most accurate, sir.
Yes.
I have never thought of doing anything to highlight the surmisings of the Western church fathers as Westerners, but as you mentioned it, I would give it serious consideration.
Yes.
It should be known.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
it's a huge thing because it appears to be working, and the movement is growing in various branches of this.
You see,
And
Very large ministries.
yeah,
you
are
see,
we deluding ourselves? If you have any material, I would really appreciate it.
you see, that is why Jews watch Westerners and laugh and ridicule them. Because the Jews understand the context of the scriptures, while the Jews watch these Westerners like deluded folks that are talking about Jesus and salvation as people who, and I said it recently, they speak about it as though with the same conviction of people who believe UFOs coming to take over the planet.
Yeah.
It's a
This
massive
thing-
delusion.
Yeah. This thing you taught tonight needs to be class number 1.
Well, we're talking about redefining your perspective, right? So you need
This is
information
huge.
to
This is
redefine.
huge.
Look,
Yeah.
this is, I'm telling you, you're going to get crickets. First time you put this out here, it's going to be crickets. I'm telling you.
You're true.
Even tonight, I'm telling you, even tonight when Keturah was teaching tonight on self-existence, a couple people that wasn't on last night came on tonight. And I heard crickets from them. Usually I hear a lot from them. But they hadn't heard of the self-existence. And I know they talk a lot of stuff from the religious system. And so I just thank God for the opportunity to expose them.
Okay. Don't hit them too hard. They're a little ignorant. That's what.
I'm not going too hard. I'm just looking at how you get exposed. Because when I first hear stuff, it take a while for it to wrap around my brain.
Right.
But it makes me go think and make me go look in the scriptures what they said.
Right. Okay. I understand what you're saying.
Zane?
Somebody saying something? I hear a voice.
Yes, Loretta.
Go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Does that mean like all of the Christian psychology and like somebody said sozo and theophostics and all of that is kind of in line with what you're talking about now, that it doesn't make like it's not necessary healing
Yes.
of soul wounds and stuff like that?
Yeah. They just don't know. Because, even Western theology in particular is influenced by a lot of Greek thought. But as I said, we could talk about that, but I can't unpack that here tonight. We could have a separate session where we could sit down and start to pull that into pieces. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What?
I was just wondering if that was all included. I didn't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good because we need to deconstruct from that delusion.
Right.
Yes, we do, and that's why we're putting it out. That's why we're saying I'm not saying to be hard. I know I sound like I'm harsh sometimes. That's my voice, but I'm not being harsh. I really care about what people, are
experience.
getting.
Yeah. I fully grasp what you're saying.
Yeah, and because I also I realized that I had wasted a whole lot of time, especially on that generational stuff.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. No, I think by looking at this here tonight, you all would see and have a little more depth into understanding when I say that we at the Institute had to abandon the entire westernized construct because the experiments for about 2 years had little manifestation to no manifestation.
Right.
And when we abandoned the entire system and we began to understand what the scriptural construct is, that is when we begin to see manifestation, which is what we pass on, but we could only pass it on in tidbits because the entire westernized construct, the perspective is what everybody's accustomed to. So I coming out and saying this is like speaking some sort of alien language. Like I just touched down from Saturn and I say yeah. That's all they hear.
Yeah, they're gonna call you heresy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But being under you for so long, this really nailed it for me to actually visualize and see along this timeline. It really nailed it for me tonight. It was really, really good.
And I'm glad to hear that. So at least it gives you a foundation to begin to question, to start to redefine your perspectives, because it could be within the delusion of the westernized society.
Zane, can I say one thing? So I just wanted to say one thing, and then you tell me what you think, Zane. I feel like we've talked about this before, but I feel like what God showed me over the last few months, because I've been learning this, is that like regarding other Christians, but not just Christians, just anybody, that I was asking him about it and wondering why some people hear God and like what are they hearing, and like, is it true, like all that stuff. Because it can be confusing, but I feel like if I could say this in a simple way, I feel like what God showed me was like he's a gentleman, and that like he still speaks to everybody.
Everybody
still works in their life, and they still like, they may have completely wrong theology, but he's still like speaking through their theology wherever they are, and speaking directly to them.
So
it's amazing.
Yeah, but that's the only way for you to come out, because if you couldn't hear him at all, you would not question where you stand. That makes sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't be where I am now if I couldn't hear him through the theology I have.
Exactly.
Me too, Hannah. Yep, me too.
We're all we've been there. So I'm just saying that because I feel like why he was showing me that is that there's hope for everyone to see the truth and to not waste, even if they just waste the first 40 years and not the last 20, right? It's like somehow that people could get the truth even if it's at the last minute,
I 1000% agree with what you're saying.
Me too, because he could anything, like even that deliverance ministry or whatever, because if that person is stuck in that repetitious thing, God can use somebody in the deliverance thing and deliver them and help them see the light a little bit, right, until they move on. I've noticed this through my walk when I first went to a church, and I was like very argumentative about what they were teaching. And then God had to stop me and say, Tanya, they're like pulling people out of like bad waters. Like he showed me a mountain, and they're at the bottom of the mountain, they're pulling people out. So he says, I can use any one of these pillars to get where my people need to be.
So what you're saying there is actually mentioned in the book of Ecclesiasticus, but it's not included in the King James Version. In the book of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, he says, which is to your point, that because men have actually been outside of where they should be, God created doctors. Because it is not his will that you should suffer, perish, even though you don't believe in the truth. And in your case, and in case with regards to what you're saying there, from that principle, I drew the same thing that you're saying. So these people believe that they're actually suffering for something, and if they believe it, God is so merciful, or God's love and approval is so much that he would actually put somebody there to help you with your system, so that you could actually be in peace. Which is what doctors are.
Sweet. Isn't he so sweet?
Yeah.
It's like God meets you where you at to get you to the point where he wants you to be.
Yeah. I never forgot in 2016 in particular. I mentioned this to somebody recently. In 2016 in particular, when I came to the understanding that the westernized construct was very creative and had nothing to do with this thing. And I asked God, I think it was a conversation I was having with Hannah, and I asked God, and I expressed this. I asked God, why did it take so long for him to just reveal this? And the response was resounding. And he actually told me, it didn't take me 2 years to teach you. It took me 2 years to prove you wrong.
Oh my goodness.
Because you're holding on to this thing here, and I'm telling you this here, and I'm taking time to prove your doctrine wrong.
Come on.
That puts all into perspective, right? Jesus gives the breath of life into all men. So you're hearing God as you go along.
Okay.
Right.
That's good.
Right. So is this clear to everybody so far?
Yeah, so good, so good.
Yes,
Nice.
that's very clear.
So again, there's a great necessity to start redefining your perspectives. All right, so I'll take a look at a few scripture verses here just to support, just included these just to support what we have been speaking about. And you see here, Exodus 31, for example. Let's read Deuteronomy 4 first. This is...
I
Say again?
don't know. I wasn't saying that. Earlier? Yeah. No, I have to clear that up.
Yeah, so what you're actually looking at here, just some verses, just to support what we were just speaking about, right? Deuteronomy 4, this was actually given to Israel. It said to Israel, you shall not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, which is the contract, so that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I'm commanding you. Now this is where it gets interesting. Exodus 31 says, so the Israelites shall observe the Sabbath. Now the reason why I actually give this verse here, because the Sabbath is actually one out of 613 items of that law. And if you said that you are supposed to keep all according to this, you can't add to it, then exactly what is said here is exactly towards the whole law. It says, so the Israelites shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout the generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the Israelites. See it right there? The law is for between God and the Israelites, not the Greeks, not the Ethiopians, not to the French, not to the Scottish,
Read over that.
not to the Africans, not to the Trinbagonians, to the Israelites. All right. All right. So it says there's a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and in 7 days and was refreshed. Now look at this concerning the Gentiles, to those who are non-Israelites. Ephesians chapter 2 says, from verse 11 to verse 12, therefore, this is Paul speaking to the uncircumcised. Therefore, remember that at one time you Gentiles by birth, who are called uncircumcision, by those who call themselves circumcision, itself a mere mark which is made in the flesh by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separated from Christ, excluded from any relationship with him, alienated from the commandments of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, with no share in the sacred messianic promise and without knowledge of God's agreements, having no hope in his promise, and living in the world without God. Where does it say that the law was for them? They're outside the covenant. It was between God and Israel. Jesus is the one that came and renewed his spirit. Then Romans chapter 2 verse 14, when Gentiles who do not have the law, since it was given only to Jews, can we get more right here? Can we get more right? It was given not to Gentiles, but to the Jews, do instinctively the things the law requires, guided only by their conscience. They are law to themselves, though they do not have the law. So every Westerner here that fighting to be under the law, and why you need to give tithes, because you're robbing watch me. We need to come out of that. We need to come out of that.
You need to make a shirt with that one.
So this just to make it even clearer here. This is the circle of all humanity. This is the circle of the circumcised. The law was given to these guys here. These guys here never sinned. They inherited Adam's dysfunction. In this case, his sin. These guys are the ones sinning because they had an agreement. They have no agreement, so they have no agreement to breach. Make sense?
Yes.
Is this simple? All right. All right.
Gonna ruffle some feathers there, brother.
Well, we're good away.
So sin was not imputed to the Israelites until the law came in.
Exactly. And that's what Paul in Romans takes his time to unpack.
Yeah. And then there were two laws. There were the 10 Commandments, which they broke. And then there was the book of the law and the book of the, no, there was the book of the covenant and the book of the law.
No, well, the 10 Commandments is actually the first 10 commandments of the book of the law. The rest of the law was given after the 10.
After that, and they carried that on the side of the tent when they moved from place to place.
Exactly. The tablets was a representation of the entire code.
So under the new covenant, then sin is not imputed to us because Yeshua took it all.
Under the new covenant, you have the right of life. Nobody is in sin.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
That's why Paul says, repeat reconciliation. Sins have been cancelled.
He doesn't keep a record of sin anymore. It's basically the war is over.
Exactly. You sow and reap. That's all.
Yeah.
Jesus canceled that program. Shut down that operating system.
Yeah. So when you go wrong, you can ask forgiveness, can't you? And then.
Well, I mean, if you know what you're doing there isn't according to your breath, then you need to change your mindset. Repent, which means change your mind.
Yeah. So what's the role of the Holy Spirit?
To actually help you walk by your breath and abandon the mindset that you have built on external reference points.
Yes, Lord.
Self-existence. That's what he's there for. The Holy Spirit is the self-existent spirit, the spirit of self-existence. That's what the word holy there is. Being set apart onto living from the breath. These things are not known in the Western world. That's the whole point here.
How did you learn it?
Huh?
How did you learn it?
Again, I can't unpack that right here right now. Well, we can talk about it in an upcoming session. I hope.
Man, you better spend a week with us.
that is our next hour, right?
Look, that alone, Zane, is you get a whole bunch of crickets. And only reason I say crickets is because the people is not saying nothing because it's a new teaching to them.
Yeah.
And when you start talking about that you didn't sin, but it's the sowing and reaping.
Yeah.
That is some new stuff right there, and so that's why we got a lot of quietness going on. And you can almost cut that with a knife. That's how quiet it is.
Right. All right. So the other thing that I want to actually see if I can finish this presentation. This have a couple more slides. So the other thing that we have to take into consideration is that in looking at this circle here, you were outside here, always outside here. That's what Paul makes very clear. Which means you referencing the law is actually a little bit it has nothing to do with you. When we read the New Testament though, we must read the New Testament through this lens. Because if you remember, there was an acknowledgement of this in Galatians chapter 2, when Paul went to see Peter, James, and John, the pillars of the church as he referred to them, and they agreed after the discussion, after hearing what Paul said and how Paul expressed what he expressed, they agreed by a handshake that Peter, James, and John would stay talking to these guys here, which is why they talk about the law. Whilst Paul and Barnabas decided, well, we're going outside here. So they do not talk sin to these guys. They talk new man, old man, because that is the only thing that was done for them. Their spirit was changed. And when he tries to explain to them why what they're doing is wrong, the only reference point that he has to explain that is the law, because the law is the principle of the self-existent. He uses it to explain why what you're doing is not according to your breath, but according to your old paradigm, which is using the dust as your reference point to determine what you do. This is why he says spirit, flesh. That's the only thing that he could speak to these guys here. Is that making sense?
This makes a lot of sense, Brother Zane. And I look at your diagram and I say to myself, wow, does this mean Does this mean that the whole messianic movement is off the track?
Yeah, through the westernized system.
Oh my goodness, a mixture.
Yes, sir.
Mixture. Wow, that's huge.
Yes, sir.
Wow.
All right, and this is where this is actually taken from Galatians chapter 2, verse 9. And recognizing the grace that God had bestowed on me, James and Cephas, Peter and John, who were reputed to be the pillars of the Jerusalem church, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we could go to the Gentiles with their blessing, and they to the circumcised. So again, the agreement was Peter, James, and John stay with these guys here. Paul and Barnabas, we're going outside here. Which is why this community, the leaders of this community, assigned men unto Paul to go in every country that were Gentiles and tell the Jewish community outside in the different countries what he was doing, and they appointed men to go find him and stone him, because it was against the national law of the Jews, who was just separated. They were throughout the diaspora. They were scattered, but it was their law that anything concerning the Messiah stays in this circle right here. He went outside here, and so they appointed men to find him, to follow him, and to stir up the Jewish communities wherever he went, to stone him, which is why he found it, he referred to it as something good and glorious, because they're fighting him to keep it here, and he bringing it outside here.
I was saying, you better watch out then.
All right, Romans chapter 2, verse 14. When Gentiles who do not have the law, since it was given only to Jews, do instinctively the things the law requires, guided only by their conscience, they are law to themselves, though they do not have the law. Never given the law.
So we bring ourselves under our own law.
Under your own condemnation.
Yeah.
Because this explains the self-righteousness of Jews, really, because think about it, their heritage is that we were almost disposable.
Yep.
It seems like humankind was disposable if they weren't Israelites. Like they were dying by the thousands, right? They were killed by the thousands and all kind, just kind of like whatever they're doing. And so they have like this almost like a hierarchy over us still.
And they watch us like that. The Orthodox Jews, they still watch us like that.
Yeah, I know. I have family that is Jew, and he's very, very condescending.
Because according to them, you are nothing but an animal, Because through the Torah, because the Torah is the principle of the self-existent, they understand that the Torah is the expression of, even though they may not know this theologically, but the Torah, because they follow the Torah is the expression of the self-existent, which means that it is the expression of the pre-fallen man. So because of that, anything that is actually outside of that expression of the pre-fallen man, God clothed with animal skin, which means that you are an animal. So in their paradigm, they are living and have what it takes to walk in God, and you are just an animal and a dog, and they will treat you as such. You understand that?
Yeah, and even in the Old Testament, though, God made exceptions to people that weren't Israelites to join the Israelites.
Yeah.
Times, right?
Yeah. And that's what got the Jewish leaders angry when Jesus brought it to their attention. And say, "Oh, you're living from this paradigm, but everybody that God reached out to, shorty famine was a non-Israelite. Naaman, who got healed, he was a non-Israelite, and all they still want healing."
Right. Does he reign on the just and the unjust? Right?
Jesus hitting them for 6 licks. You're self-righteous. and they had a right to be self-righteous over time, because they lost sight of what the purpose of this book of the law was for. And they made it something about clout instead of actually function. which was the whole issue with the Jewish leaders also. Make sense?
Yeah, even today, Brother Zane, I was reading the infamous Babylonian Talmud.
Uh-huh.
Even worse.
Yeah.
they in their Talmud, it says that it's even right. It's okay for them to kill the Gentiles, no problem.
Because they are animals.
Isn't that something? Eh?
Yeah, but holy brother, look at the religious community that is using the same law. The westernized religious community is the same self-righteousness that you see in there too. Treat them as though they are dogs. It's the nature of self-righteousness. So it's the same spirit, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yes, and it also very much so. It's actually mind-boggling when you think of the lies that we have believed and how we've fashioned our lives and our lifestyles around these lies.
Yes, sir.
I go back to your diagram earlier there. At the resurrection, if no one accepts Jesus in their hearts, what's the situation for them personally?
Yeah.
Are if they haven't accepted Jesus in their hearts, they go to hell? Or if they don't even know about Jesus, what happens then, you know?
That's what they're teaching, right?
Yeah, it's another teaching.
That's what they're teaching.
That's another teaching. That's about hell. The scare tactics.
Yeah.
So what about the biblical feasts then?
Holy sister, I can't unpack that here today either.
Okay. Because Yeshua acknowledged them, so I'm wondering what we're supposed to be doing.
Right. We could talk about that in a future session, yeah?
Oh my goodness, your list must be growing.
I'm hearing that. All right, so points to note here. The Old Testament was unto the law, unto the Israel, not uncircumcised, which means all this end time judgment has nothing to do with Gentiles. Which is why John and Jesus in the book of Revelation speaks in the manner of the law, because he's speaking to Jewish communities. And the destruction was coming upon Jerusalem for the destruction of heaven and earth, the temple. So all of the prophets of the Old Testament, every author of the Old Testament were under the law, and so they speak from the perspective of those under the law. It is for this reason that when you read in the Old Testament, you have no business with the rules. Your priority is to see what God said, because what God said is actually said in the same breath that you're breathing. And if you see what God says, then you know what is in your breath, and therefore you know what you can reproduce. That's the only context of that of the scriptures for you as the renewed man, the new man. New Testament letters are written to two separate audiences, as I mentioned. So when you're reading Peter, James, and John, you cannot try to attribute that to your lives. They're speaking to a Jewish community who are under the law. That community was under the law, and therefore they're speaking to them in their language. To the uncircumcised, law is only reference for principles for better understanding. Paul does not refer to them as sinners. He says, old man, new man. Old man, new man. Instead of walking in the flesh, walk in the breath. Understand what is in your breath and walk it out. Learn Christ. Learn the breath of life. And stop using your body as the discerner to know what to do and what not to do. What your breath is where you actually know what to do and what to manifest, what to create. Right? So when you're reading the New Testament, these are things that you want to take into consideration. If you don't take into consideration, you are going to be utterly confused and you are going to be back and forth, because technically what you're doing is reading Paul from the perspective of uncircumcised, and then you go into Peter's letter, John's letter, James' letter, and you sit down in the seat of the circumcised, which you were not in, and you're trying to attribute that to yourself. Where and how can you not be confused by that? Is this making sense?
So what should we focus on, Brother Zane, in terms of the new covenant? The new covenant as regards we who were former Gentiles, not under the law. What therefore should in the New Testament we focus on that applies to us?
So we can deconstruct.
Two things. Number one, the breath of life, which is what Paul is referring to and trying to explain to these Gentiles. With regards to, he's saying, learn Christ. To learn Christ is to actually learn what the breath of life is. Paul used the law to try to give them better understanding, because the law is the principle of the self-existent, which is what Christ is, the self-existent Son. Therefore, when you're looking at the law in particular, there are two sides to the law: Israel's side to the law, God's side to the law. Israel's side to the law is for men who are corrupted. God's side of the law is self-existent. They are told what not to do so that they can actually function. If Jesus has now removed all of that and put the breath of life back into you, now you search the scriptures to be familiar with the promises of God. And if you're not sure if what this is here, whether it's coming from the breath or you're using the body to discern what to do and what not to do, then what the principle is expressed in the law can give you clarity as to what really is in the breath. But it is not to live from. It's just like an old document that has some valuable principles in it to help you understand Christ in you better. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to everybody.
I want to add to that what you just said. That thing yesterday, you guys talked about David. That was an awesome example of what you're just talking about right now.
Yes.
How
yes.
David handled the giant.
Right.
And that was just a perfect example. So if you can do more of that, that'd be awesome. Because that was so good. And I actually had felt like God had kind of spoke to me about that in the past,
Right.
but it was so clear when I heard what y'all were talking about yesterday.
Okay. All right. So that's cool. We will definitely put some emphasis on that.